Jasmine?
Don't take off your shoes, Taewoo.
You won't be staying long.
Ti-Woo's footsteps retreated toward the kitchen, easy and unhurried, the sound of a man who believed the night was exactly what it appeared to be. Jasmine stayed where she was, on the edge of the coffee table, her mug still warm in her hands from a tea she hadn't taken a single sip of. Subject is compliant. The asset will be delivered by the end of the week as planned. The words sat behind her eyes, fully formed, refusing to dissolve the way ordinary thoughts dissolved when something else demanded attention. She could still feel the ghost of his hand at the back of her neck, his thumb on her jaw, the particular heat in his voice when he told her to be careful what she played with. None of that had felt like performance. That was the part she couldn't yet reconcile. The warmth had been so completely, convincingly real that her body hadn't caught up to what her eyes had seen. He came back with 2 mugs, steam curling off both, and set hers down in front of her with the casual domesticity of a man who did this every week, who alphabetized nothing on purpose but somehow always remembered how she liked her tea. "Careful, it's hot," he said, settling onto the couch beside her. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out normal. She noted that distantly, the way she noted everything now, a small, cold part of her mind already starting to catalog, the same part that had once caught a 30-second pause from a receptionist and known something was wrong before she had words for it. She drank the tea. It tasted like nothing. He talked about something, a contractor, a permit delay, the kind of small architecture world complaint that had always made her laugh because of how genuinely irritated he got over things that didn't matter. Tonight she heard the words without absorbing them, nodding in the right places, watching his hands instead of his face, because hands, she was beginning to understand, told the truth more reliably than anything else about him. His hands were steady. That was either reassuring or the most frightening thing she'd noticed all night, and she genuinely didn't know which. "You're quiet," he said eventually, setting his mug down. "Long day," she said. "School stuff. Elena's teacher wants to talk about reading groups." It wasn't a lie, exactly. It just wasn't the truth either, and she felt the particular vertigo of becoming, in real time, the kind of person who managed information the way the men in her life had always managed it with her. She hated how natural it felt. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the same gesture he'd used 100 times, and she let him, because flinching away would have told him everything before she was ready for him to know it. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "I'll lock up on my way out." "Okay." At the door, he paused, the way he always did, and looked back at her with an expression she had spent 16 months learning to read as safety. "Good night, beautiful." "Good night." The door clicked shut. Jasmine sat in the silence of her own living room for a long time, the second mug of tea going cold beside the first, and felt something settle into place inside her that she recognized from 6 years ago and had hoped never to need again. The strategist did not panic. The strategist gathered. She didn't sleep that night, not really, lay in the dark running the same 4 words over and over until they stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a code she hadn't yet learned to break. Subject, compliant, asset, delivered, clean, clinical language. The language of a man reporting on a job, not a man falling asleep beside someone he loved. By morning she had a plan, the same way she'd always had a plan, even in the years she'd been too broken to admit she was making one. She would not confront him yet. She would learn first, quietly, completely, the way she'd learned to survive everything else in this story, not through accusation, but through evidence, because accusation without evidence had nearly destroyed her once already, 6 years ago, in a marriage built on someone else's fabricated proof. This time, if she was going to burn something down, she was going to know exactly what she was burning. It started with a phone call he took on the balcony 3 days later. This was not in itself suspicious. Ti-Woo took calls on the balcony sometimes, clients, contractors, the particular kind of conversation that required packing. A week ago, she wouldn't have thought twice about it. Now she watched the door close behind him and started a clock in her head. 11 minutes. He came back in with his face reset to its usual ease, and she understood, watching him cross the room toward her with that same warm, unhurried confidence, that he had no idea she had begun, quietly and completely, to dismantle him the same way he apparently knew how to dismantle other people. Work, she asked, not really asking. Permit issue, he said, boring stuff. She smiled and let it go, the same way she'd let go of 100 small things in the last 6 years that had turned out to matter more than she'd known at the time. She was done letting things go. She was just better now at not showing it. 3 weeks of careful, devastating discovery are about to unfold. Subscribe to Afro Soul Diaries by D. Jasmine is about to become the most dangerous person in this story. She was good at this. That was the part nobody accounted for when they underestimated her. 6 years of careful, language-precise work had given her an eye for inconsistency that most people never developed, because most people weren't translators, weren't trained to notice when something had been almost perfectly rendered but not quite, the seam where a fabrication met the truth and didn't fully match. She started noticing seams in Tiwu. The architecture firm he worked for, Hala Structural Group, was real. She checked casually the way you check anything about someone you loved, more out of habit than suspicion. The firm existed. It had a real address in Jongno, a real website, real projects in its portfolio, his name attached to actual buildings she could find on a map. But when she called, on the pretext of asking about scheduling a consultation for a friend, the receptionist had taken 30 seconds too long to confirm he worked there. A pause that didn't belong in a simple yes. She filed it away. 2 days later, Alina found a parking stub folded around a handwritten number and a name that was Tiwu. "Whose is this?" Alina had asked, holding it up with the casual destructiveness of a child who has no idea she's just detonated something. Tiwu had taken it from her so fast it was almost a flinch. "A colleague," he'd said. "I'm holding it for someone." Jasmine had watched his hands. They didn't shake, but his thumb had pressed into the edge of the card hard enough to bend it, and that was the kind of detail her job had trained her to catch, the body telling a truth the mouth wasn't ready to. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She started keeping her own records instead. She found the second phone on a Tuesday. Not snooping, or not only snooping, though she would later be honest with herself that this was exactly what it was, justified or not. He'd left his jacket on the chair, and when she moved it to make room for Alina's backpack, something heavier than a phone usually had shifted in the inner pocket. She stood in the kitchen, holding it for a long moment before she made the decision to look. It wasn't locked. The screen was still live from the call he'd just taken on the balcony, glowing in the dimness of the kitchen. A man actively running a scam keeps the deadbolts thrown. A man who is simply exhausted from 16 months of carrying a lie forgets to press the power button. He was getting careless because the guilt was making him heavy. The messages were sparse, functional, written in the clipped, professional language of someone reporting facts rather than feelings. Subject continues to maintain residence at listed address. No security changes observed. Will advise if status changes. That one was 16 months old. She scrolled further. The messages thinned dramatically after the first 6 weeks, not stopped, but slowed to the point of near silence, months passing between entries, the cadence of a man who had clearly lost interest in whatever this assignment had originally been. And then, 3 weeks ago, the same week, she now realized that the tea had gone cold in her hands. A new message had arrived, the first in months. Need status update. Has the situation with KSJ progressed? Client wants confirmation before proceeding. KSJ. Kim Seojun. She put the phone back exactly where she'd found it, and the message she'd seen the night of the tea finally made sense as the reply to this one. Confirmation. Sent. The night he'd had his hand on her jaw, and told her to be careful what she played with. He had answered that message minutes after telling her he wasn't going anywhere. She didn't confront him that night either. A name and a pattern weren't an answer. They were the start of one. If you've ever felt the floor shift under something you trusted, you already know exactly what Jasmine is feeling right now. Subscribe to Afro Soul Diaries by D. This story is about to get a lot more dangerous. Alina noticed before Jasmine said anything. This was the thing about her daughter that continued to undo her. The radar children had for the emotional weather of a household. The way Alina could read tension in a room the way other people read weather reports, without needing to understand the cause. You and Tiwu are doing the quiet thing, Alina said one evening, looking up from her homework with the particular directness she applied to everything. Jasmine set down the dish towel. We're not doing a thing. You're doing a thing, Alina said, unconvinced. Last time you did the thing it was about the crying man. His name is Siajan, sweetheart, and we're working some things out, adult things. Alina considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Is Tiwu in trouble? Jasmine sat down across from her daughter. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm trying to find out. Is he going to leave? The question landed harder than Jasmine had braced for. The way Alina's questions always seemed to find the exact center of whatever Jasmine was trying not to think about. I don't know that either, she said. Alina went back to her homework, but her pencil had slowed, and Jasmine watched her daughter process something too large for her vocabulary, sitting with it the way Jasmine herself had been sitting with the full shape of what she'd discovered for days now. Jasmine didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure she'd have one for a long time. She called Siajan the next morning, before Alina woke up, standing in the kitchen with her voice pitched low. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to tell me the truth, because I am extremely tired of men in my life deciding what version of reality I'm allowed to know. A pause on the line. Ask, he said. Did you hire someone to investigate me? The silence that followed was longer than she wanted it to be. Siajan. Not you, he said finally, not exactly. That is not an answer. After the divorce, his voice had the particular strain of a man choosing every word with deliberate care, the way he'd spoken in the cafe months ago when he'd been managing a different truth. I needed to understand what I'd missed, not about you specifically, about Seiyin, what else she might have manipulated, who else she might have used. I didn't trust my own judgment anymore, Jasmine. I had no reason to. So you hired an investigator to track people connected to her, associates, anyone she'd had financial dealings with. I wanted to know the full scope of what she'd done before it could hurt anyone else. Jasmine's hand tightened around the phone. And somewhere in that investigation, she said slowly, a name came up, an address, a building in Haiyu. Silence. Yes, he said. Was it my building? I didn't know that, he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly. I swear to you, Jasmine, I never asked anyone to watch you directly. The investigator was tracking Seiyin's known associates and contacts. One of the addresses on a list connected to her surveillance network happened to be, he stopped. It happened to be where you lived. I didn't know that until much later. I didn't keep tracking him, Jasmine, Siajan added, his voice dropping an octave. 6 weeks into the job, you sent me a final invoice and a certified report saying your building was clear, and Seiyin's people had moved on. He officially closed the case file on my end. I had no reason to doubt him, and I didn't find out until months later that he'd stayed in Haiyu under a fake name, completely off my payroll, just to keep watch on his own. Jasmine's hand tightened around the phone. What was his name? She asked, though she already knew. Another silence, the kind that told her everything before the words arrived. Yun Tiwu, Siajan said. She took a slow breath, the kind she'd trained herself to take when the floor moved, not panic, just the deliberate work of staying upright. She had half known. Hearing it confirmed out loud was still its own kind of door slamming shut. He moved in next to you, Siajan said, because Saiyan already had someone watching that building. He was sent to find out who and why and what they'd been documenting. I didn't send him to surveil you. I sent him to find out if you were already being surveilled. I didn't know until it was already happening that the two things had become the same thing. Jasmine sat down very slowly at her own kitchen table, in the apartment that had held both the warmest night of her year and the coldest morning after it, and understood that she had spent 16 months falling in love with a man who had walked into her life because someone else had already been watching her, and he had simply gotten there first. It still wasn't the whole answer. It was an origin, not an explanation. This is the part where everything you thought you understood gets rewritten, and I promise, it gets worse before it gets better. She found the rest of what she would let herself find before she stopped, over the following 10 days, piece by piece, the way she'd been trained to find anything, methodically, patiently, refusing to let her own grief slow the process down. She didn't find the answers through pure luck. It took 12 straight nights after Alina went asleep, sitting in the blue glare of her laptop, manually cross-referencing public tax filings against foreign language registry databases. Most people wouldn't have noticed the 3% variance in a subcontractor routing line, but 6 years of legal translation had trained her to find the exact seam where a corporate fabrication meets the truth. That was how she found the hidden connection. The investigators' reports, once she'd gained enough access to understand the shape of them, told a story that unfolded in stages, the same way the truth always seemed to in this family now. Answer, bigger question, answer, bigger question. Ti-Woo had taken the initial assignment exactly 2 months before he'd lost his sofa and knocked on her door. 60 days of clinical monitoring, followed by 16 months of a relationship, totaling a year and a half of a beautifully constructed lie. The early weeks had been exactly what Seojin described: surveillance of Saiyan's known associates, the building flagged as a location of interest because someone matching Saiyan's payment patterns had been documented watching it. Ti-Woo's task had simply been to find out who and report back. He had found Jasmine. The reports from the first 6 weeks were clinical. Observed subjects' daily patterns, no contact with known associates of PS, recommend continued low-level monitoring. And then, abruptly, the reports stopped being clinical. The 6th week's report was 3 lines long instead of 3 paragraphs. The 7th week's report didn't mention Jasmine at all, only a brief, almost embarrassed note about needing more time to assess the situation. By week 10, the reports had stopped almost entirely. The silence Jasmine had already found in his second phone, the cadence of a man who had quietly, without permission from anyone including himself, stopped being an investigator. She found one entry, dated 4 months after he'd moved in, that wasn't a report at all. It looked like something he'd started writing and never sent. I don't know how to tell the client this stopped being what it was. I don't know how to tell anyone, including myself. The longer I stay, the harder it becomes to leave, and I don't think I want to leave anymore, and that should terrify me more than it does. He had never sent it. Jasmine read it 4 times before she finally allowed herself to cry. Not the public, dignified kind of crying she permitted herself at the gala or in the cafe, but the private, undefended kind she hadn't done in 6 years. Sitting alone at her kitchen table at 2 a.m. with 16 months of a man's hidden devotion spread out in front of her like evidence of a crime that had somehow, impossibly, also been a love letter. She had enough now to ask him why he'd lied. She didn't have enough yet to ask him what, exactly, he'd become while he was lying. She told herself that conversation could wait for another night, and didn't examine too closely why some part of her was relieved to delay it. One unforgettable scene is coming. You've been warned. She confronted him on a Thursday with only the second phone and the printed reports on the table between them. Not everything, just the first layer. She heard his key in the door at 7:14. She did not move. He came in the way he always came in, easy, unhurried, calling her name before he'd even gotten his shoes off, the particular cadence of a man walking into a home he believed was his. Jasmine. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. His eyes went to the table. then to her face, then back to the table, doing the same arithmetic she'd been doing for weeks, except he was doing it in real time and she had the advantage of having already finished. What's all this? Don't take off your shoes, Ti-Woo. Her voice was dangerously calm, the kind of calm she'd learned in a clinic in Itaewon 6 years ago and had hoped never to need again. You won't be staying long. He stepped forward, hands dropping to his sides, and for the first time since she'd met him, she watched him search for words and not find them immediately. Jasmine, whatever you think you're looking at. You were hired to watch me, she said. 16 months ago, you reported on me to a client, and you let me fall in love with you while you were doing it. His face went very still, not denial, just the specific stillness of a man who'd known this night would arrive and had never managed to prepare for it anyway. Yes, he said. Seojin hired you. Yes. And you kept going. After you knew it was wrong, you kept reporting on me for 6 weeks. Yes. Then you stopped. Why? I closed it with Seojin, officially, but I never really walked away from it. By then I knew there had been people watching that building before I arrived, and I couldn't stand the idea of leaving without knowing you were safe. So I stayed. I stopped doing the job, and I never told you any of it. Jasmine looked at him for a long moment. That's not enough of an answer for 16 months of silence, she said. But it's all I'm going to get tonight, isn't it? He didn't say anything. That was its own answer. Get out, she said. He left without arguing. At the door he paused like he wanted to say more, and then didn't, because there was nothing left that would have made it better in that particular moment, and they both knew it. She knows he lied. She doesn't know what he is, and I promise the worst is still ahead. The first week passed in silence, then another. She didn't call him once. She didn't return any of his calls either. She also didn't stop looking. Nearly a month after she found the second phone, it started with something small, a payment record from Hala Structural Group that didn't match a salary, routed through a subsidiary she didn't recognize. Restructuring Solutions. She told herself she was looking for closure. She knew, somewhere underneath that, she was looking for a reason either to forgive him or to make sure she never did. She called Seojin again, 4 days later, the payment record still open on her laptop screen. There's a division under his firm, she said. Restructuring Solutions. I don't understand what it is, and I think you do. A long silence. There are things about Ti-Woo I don't think you know, Seojin said finally. What things? They're not mine to tell. Seojin. But if you're asking whether he kept working after the assignment officially ended, he said, the answer is yes. I won't tell you more than that. Some of it isn't safe for me to say over a phone, and most of it isn't mine to explain in the first place. You need to hear it from him. The line went quiet. Should I trust him? Jasmine asked anyway, because she didn't know who else to ask. Seojin laughed short, low, more bitter than amused. You're asking the wrong man, he said. I was trusted completely once, by you, and I failed it not because I lied, but because I let someone else hand me a lie and didn't fight hard enough to find the truth underneath it. A pause. The question isn't whether he lied to you. Plenty of people lie. The question is what he did with the truth once he actually had it. But that's an answer only he can give you. Go ask him. He hung up before she could press further. Seojin knows something. He won't say what. Afrosoul Diaries by D. Jasmine is about to find out the hard way. She didn't call Ti-Woo that night. She sat with the unanswered shape of it for 2 more days, turning the words restructuring and dissolution, and kept working over in her mind without a single concrete picture to hang them on. She didn't know if she was about to learn he was dangerous, or criminal, or something with no clean name at all. The not knowing was its own particular kind of exhausting. She called him on a Tuesday. I found something, she said before he could say hello. A division under your firm, Restructuring Solutions. I don't understand what it is. I want you to explain it to me. Tonight. A pause. Okay, he said. I'll come over. He came home at 7:14 again, the same time as always, as if some part of him still believed in the ordinary architecture of an evening even now. She laid nothing out on the table this time. She didn't need props anymore. She just needed him to talk. "Start with what that division actually does," she said. He sat down across from her slowly, like a man sitting for something he knew he wouldn't get to walk away from clean. "About 4 years ago, a surveillance job I was finishing turned up something larger than the original assignment," he said. "Financial structures, the architecture of how someone stays untouchable. I'm good at seeing structure, Jasmine. It's the same skill, whether it's a building or a conspiracy. I started applying it to people who'd spent their whole careers building things designed never to be found." "What does that mean, specifically?" "I take things apart," he said, "carefully, sometimes legally, financial networks, leverage structures, the kind of dismantling that makes a problem stop existing without anyone needing to know I was ever in the room." He looked at her steadily. "I used to tell myself I only went after people who'd already hurt someone else first. The older I get, the less certain I am that anyone should have that much power over another person's life, including me." Jasmine sat with that, the specific weight of finally having a name for the thing she'd been circling for weeks, and the way the name didn't make it smaller, only clearer. "How long?" she said. 4 years. And the work with Sayan's network, after the legal case closed the visible parts of it. "That was mine," he said. "Nobody asked me to finish it. I did, because I wanted to make sure nothing was left that could ever reach you or Alina again." Jasmine looked at the man across her kitchen table for a long moment. "I need to think," she said. "Not tonight, go home." He nodded and stood, and this time he didn't try to say anything else at the door. There would be more to say, just not yet. "Now we know what he is. We still don't know why he stayed. The final answer is coming." 3 weeks later, after more thinking than sleeping, she finally called him back. 3 weeks of turning the same question over without finding its bottom. How do you love a man who has spent 4 years quietly deciding, who deserved to have their life taken apart, and still believe the version of him who sat on her floor arguing about dragon taxation was the realest thing about him? She called him on a Sunday morning. "The message," she said the moment he picked up. "The night of the tea, the asset will be delivered. I want to know what that meant, all the way down, no more pieces." "Can I come over?" "Yes." He arrived within 20 minutes, like he'd been waiting by the phone for exactly this call. He sat across from her at the same table, in the same chair, and for once didn't wait for her to ask the first question. "The asset wasn't you," he said. "Wasn't Alina. It was a file. Everything I'd quietly pulled apart from what was left of Sayan's network after the legal case closed the visible parts of it. I finished it that night. The message was confirmation it was done, sent minutes after I told you I wasn't going anywhere, because both things were true at the same time, and I didn't know how to say that without sounding like an excuse. You should have told me before that night ever happened." "The first week," he said. "The first month. The first time you fell asleep on my shoulder during a movie you'd already seen twice. Tell me which version of that conversation ends with you still in the room long enough to hear the rest of it." Jasmine flinched. Because he wasn't wrong, and because it was the first thing he'd said in days that felt less like a confession, and more like the man she'd actually fallen for: sharp, perceptive, dangerously good at finding exactly where a person's weak point sat. "Don't," she said quietly, "don't be clever with me right now." "I'm not being clever," he said. "I'm being honest. There was never going to be a comfortable time to tell you what I am. I kept choosing the version of this where I got to stay a little longer instead." The kitchen was very quiet. "Which parts were real?" Jasmine asked, the question she'd been circling through 3 separate conversations, the only one that had ever actually mattered. "All of it," he said. "The dragon tax argument, the plant. That night, every part of it before the phone lit up. That was me choosing you over the work, not performing for you while I did it. You stopped being anyone's assignment in about 6 weeks. You just never knew there was a version of me capable of the rest of what I just told you. Jasmine looked at the man across her kitchen table, the one who built things for a living and quietly took other things apart in the dark, who had no clean answer for whether what he did was right, who had just told her the truth without softening a single edge of it. She didn't tell him to get out this time. She didn't tell him to stay either. I need time, she said, more than I needed before. I know everything now, and knowing everything is somehow harder than not knowing was. I understand, he said. He left quietly. This time at the door, he didn't try to add anything else. He'd already said the truest thing he had. Which parts were real? Drop your verdict in the comments. This isn't over yet. The legal case against Se-Yin closed 11 days later. Ti-Woo's file, months of patient, methodical dismantling, gave the prosecutor everything needed to finish what remained of her operation. The associates still managing her interests. The account still funneling money toward maintaining a lie that had outlived its own usefulness years ago. The structure of a woman who had spent 6 years protecting a fabrication with the same dedication most people reserved for something worth protecting. Se-Yin did not go quietly. There was no public confrontation this time, no gala, no room full of witnesses. Just a courtroom, eventually, and a verdict that arrived without ceremony, fraud, witness tampering, the specific and exhausting list of charges that accumulate when someone spends 6 years building a structure on a foundation that was never going to hold. Jasmine went. She told herself it was for closure. She stood at the back of the gallery and watched Se-Yin, stripped of the polish that had made her so dangerous for 6 years, sit very still while the judge read the sentence. When it was finished, Se-Yin turned her head slowly and found Jasmine's eyes across the room. There was no triumph left in her face, just the pale, exhausted look of a woman who finally understood that everything she'd spent 6 years protecting had been taken apart from the inside, piece by piece, by someone she'd never even known was in the room. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Jasmine had imagined this exact second more times than she could count, in the early years, lying awake constructing speeches she'd never get to give. She'd pictured fury. She'd pictured triumph. Standing here now, she felt mostly a kind of tired clarity, the recognition that this woman across the room had spent 6 years so afraid of losing something that she'd been willing to destroy a family to keep it, and had ended up with nothing anyway. Se-Yin's mouth moved just slightly, like she might say something. The bailiff stepped forward before any sound came out. Jasmine left before the gavel came down again. She thought about the version of herself who had sat in a clinic in Itaewon alone and tried to understand what she had done wrong. She thought about the 18 months of reconstruction. She thought about the specific quality of pride required to return to a city that had seen you broken and build something good in it anyway. She felt something settle in her chest on the way out that she hadn't expected to feel as cleanly as she did. Relief, not joy. Just the hard-won relief of a woman who'd carried a wrongness she couldn't name for 6 years, finally watching the last piece of it dissolve into something that could no longer reach her daughter. Alina found out about Ti-Woo a few days after the second confrontation. Jasmine had debated how much to tell her, had drafted and discarded a dozen versions of the conversation, had landed eventually on the version that respected her daughter's intelligence, without handing her more weight than a 6-year-old should carry. Ti-Woo wasn't honest with us about something important, she said, sitting on the edge of Alina's bed in the blue evening light that seemed to host every difficult conversation in this family. A long time ago, before we really knew him, someone asked him to find out things about our family. He did that for a while. Then he stopped, because he started caring about us too much to keep doing it. But he kept another part of his life secret too, for a long time after that, work that isn't bad exactly, but isn't simple either. So he was pretending, Alina said. At the beginning, yes, and he was hiding things for a long time after that. And then he stopped pretending, just not hiding. That's what he says. I believe him about the pretending part. Alina considered this further, her small face working through something that looked, for a moment, almost adult. "If he didn't like us, why didn't he leave?" she said slowly. "Why did he stay?" Jasmine opened her mouth. She found she didn't have an answer. "He could have just left," Alina continued, working it out loud the way she worked out most things, by saying them until they made sense. Jasmine sat with her daughter's logic, which was simpler and more devastating than anything the adults in this story had managed to articulate across 2 installments of careful, adult reasoning. "I don't know the answer yet, baby," she said honestly. "That's okay," Alina said, with the same remarkable pragmatism she'd shown at every turn of this story. "You don't have to know yet, but I think the answer is that he liked us. A lot. Even when he wasn't supposed to." She turned over and went to sleep, leaving her mother sitting in the dark with a question she suspected she'd be sitting with for a long time. "If he didn't like us, why didn't he leave?" I think about this line every single day. It was nearly 3 weeks before Jasmine called him again. Not because she'd forgiven him, she was honest enough with herself to know that forgiveness, if it came, would arrive slowly and in pieces, the same way the truth always seemed to in this family. But because she had done the thing she always did, eventually, with anything that threatened to overwhelm her, she had processed it in motion, working, parenting, running at 6 a.m. through the quieter streets of Haiwa, until her lungs burned and her mind, briefly, cleared enough to think clearly about what she actually wanted instead of just what she'd lost. What she wanted, she'd finally admitted to herself, was not a man who had never lied. She didn't think that man existed, not really, not Siajan, who had believed a lie for 6 years rather than ask harder questions, not anyone she'd ever known closely enough to test. What she wanted was a man whose lies, once fully exposed, revealed something worth the cost of forgiving. She still didn't know fully if that was what she'd found. But she was willing to find out. He answered on the first ring, the way he always had. "I'm not calling to tell you I've forgiven you," she said. "I haven't. I might not for a while. But Alina asked me a question I couldn't answer, and I think you're the only person who can." "What question?" "If you were pretending," Jasmine said, "why did you stay?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. "Because somewhere around week 6, he said finally, his voice rough in a way she hadn't heard before, "I stopped being able to imagine a version of my life that didn't include both of you in it. I didn't choose that. I didn't apply for it. I just woke up one morning and realized I'd rather lose every advantage that came with knowing what I knew than lose one more dinner, where your daughter explained dragon tax law to me like I was the slow one in the room. That's not an excuse," he added quickly. "I know it's not an excuse for not telling you any of it. I just want you to know it's the truest thing I've ever said to you." "I know," Jasmine said quietly. "I think I knew it the moment I read what you never sent." "What?" "You'll find out," she said. She could hear him breathing on the other end, the particular quality of a man holding very still, the way he had the night he'd stood in her kitchen doorway and waited for her to decide whether to throw him out a second time. "Jasmine," he said, "whatever you decide, I need you to know I'm not going to argue with it. I'm not going to spend the next year trying to talk you back into something you're not sure of. I just needed you to hear the real answer once, all the way through, without managing it." "I heard it," she said. "Come over Saturday. Alina wants to show you something new she drew. I'm not promising anything beyond that, but come over Saturday." He came over Saturday. Alina opened the door before Jasmine could, because Alina had apparently been stationed by the entrance for the better part of 20 minutes, and she looked up at Ti-Woo with the same frank, assessing gaze she'd applied to him on the very first day, 16 months and one devastating revelation ago. "You lied," she said. "I did," he said, dropping to one knee so he was at her eye level. "At the beginning, and I kept secrets a lot longer than that. I'm sorry for both." "Are you still pretending?" "No," he said, and his voice didn't waver. "I haven't been pretending in a very long time. The secrets weren't about pretending, Alina. They were about being scared of what you and your mom would think if you knew everything about me. Alina studied him for a long moment, with the seriousness of a judge reaching a verdict. Okay, she said finally, her small face relaxing. Come see my new drawing. The dragon is the big boss of the office now. He has a tiny desk and a tie, and he has to protect all the gold. Ti-Woo looked up at Jasmine over her daughter's head. Jasmine didn't smile, not fully, she wasn't there yet, and she suspected she wouldn't pretend to be there before she actually was, because pretending was the exact wound this entire story had been built around. But she stepped back from the door and let him in. He didn't stay that night. He didn't stay the next several nights either. What he did instead, over the following weeks, was something neither of them had a clean word for: not dadding, not reconciliation, something slower and more deliberate, built one Saturday at a time, one honest conversation at a time, the way you rebuild something you actually want to last rather than something you're rushing to restore. She asked him questions she hadn't asked before, about the early weeks, about what he'd reported and when he'd stopped wanting to, about the other half of his life, the people he'd quietly taken apart over 4 years, what rule he'd built for himself to make sure he never became the thing he dismantled. Do you still do it? She asked him once. The other work. I don't know yet, he said. I know I don't want it to be the only thing that's true about me anymore. It wasn't a clean answer. She stopped expecting clean answers from anyone a long time ago. He answered everything else just as honestly, without flinching, without managing the truth the way Seojin once had in a cafe with rain against the windows. It was, Jasmine thought, the most honest any man in this story had ever been with her, and the fact that it had taken a catastrophic betrayal to get there was not lost on her, and was not, she suspected, something she would ever fully stop being aware of. But it was something. It was a direction, if not yet a destination. Alina conducted her own investigation, in her own way, which Jasmine only discovered weeks later when her daughter casually announced the results over dinner. I tested him, Alina said, twirling noodles around her chopsticks with the seriousness of someone delivering a verdict. Jasmine set down her own fork. You what? I asked him 3 questions. Auntie Grace says you can tell if someone's lying if you ask the same thing different ways. Auntie Grace told you that. She watches a lot of shows. Alina held up one finger. I asked Ti-Woo if he was a bad guy, Alina said, trying and failing to spin 3 noodles around a plastic chopstick. Jasmine nearly dropped her fork. You asked him what? A bad guy, Alina repeated plainly. A second finger. Then I asked if he really liked the dragon game. Alina paused for effect, the way she'd clearly been planning this part. He got really angry. He said the dragon works very hard. Despite everything, Jasmine felt a laugh escape before she could stop it. And the third question. Alina's expression went, briefly, more careful than playful. The same gravity she'd carried since the night she'd asked why a stranger was crying at her school showcase. I asked him if he was going to leave again, she said. Jasmine's chest tightened. What did he say? He said no. Then, after a beat, he said he couldn't promise everything would be okay, but he said he wasn't going anywhere. Alina shrugged, already moving on to her noodles, the verdict apparently delivered and filed away with the same brisk efficiency she applied to everything. And you believed him? Jasmine asked. Alina shrugged. Yeah. Why? Because he looked sad. Jasmine sat with that for a long moment, her daughter, 6 years old, somehow already understanding the exact distinction Jasmine herself had spent weeks circling without managing to name it so simply. That was very brave of you to ask, Alina. I know, Alina said without looking up. Can I have more juice? Ti-Woo, when Jasmine told him about it later that night over the phone, was quiet for a moment. She really asked you all that? Apparently you handled the cross-examination well, Jasmine said. Better than you handled mine, if I'm being honest. She doesn't ask follow-up questions designed to corner me, he said. She just asks the actual question and waits. Maybe that's the better method. Maybe, he agreed. I haven't figured out how to be that direct with you yet. I keep waiting for the moment that feels safe enough. There isn't going to be one, Jasmine said. I think that's the part neither of us has fully accepted. Safe isn't coming back. We're just going to have to get better at doing this without it. He didn't argue with her. That, too, she was starting to recognize as its own kind of honesty. The olive tree was still on the windowsill. She thought about throwing it out in the angriest days of those first weeks, had stood in front of it more than once with her hand actually reaching for the pot, ready to be done with the metaphor and everything it represented. But she never quite did it. It sat there, stubborn and slightly lopsided, growing a second leaf where the first one had fallen, indifferent to the chaos of the humans who kept arguing and reconciling and rebuilding trust in its general vicinity. One evening, weeks into this slow, uncertain rebuilding, Ti-Woo noticed it while helping Alina with homework at the kitchen table. You kept it, he said. It's a plant, Ti-Woo, Jasmine said, echoing his own words back at him from another lifetime. Not a metaphor. Absolutely a metaphor, he said. You just won't admit it. I'm not admitting anything tonight. Fair, he said, and went back to negotiating with Alina over whether dragons paid quarterly or annual taxes. And Jasmine stood in the kitchen doorway watching the two of them the way she had that first terrible, clarifying night, and felt something that wasn't quite peace yet, but was no longer entirely its opposite. Siajin called the following week briefly to confirm a visitation schedule for Alina, practical, businesslike, the tone of two people who had finally found the version of each other that didn't require performance. Alina had begun calling him by his name instead of the tall man, which felt, to Jasmine, like its own small, hard-won ending to a different story than the one she was still living through. Seiyin was gone, truly gone, the kind of gone that didn't come back to call personal numbers it shouldn't have had. And Ti-Woo was still here, not because he hadn't been given every reason to leave twice, and not because Jasmine had simply decided to pretend none of it had happened, but because somewhere in the wreckage of what he'd hidden and what he'd protected, there had been enough real material to build something honest out of, if both of them were willing to do the slower, harder work of actually building it. She didn't know, on this particular Saturday evening, exactly what she and Ti-Woo would become. She knew that her daughter still asked him about dragon tax law every week, and that he still answered with the same absurd, total sincerity he'd brought to it from the very beginning, before either of them knew what any of this was going to cost. She knew that the olive tree had grown a third leaf. She knew that some questions, which parts were real, why did you stay, do I trust you again, didn't resolve themselves in a single conversation, or a single chapter, or even a single, satisfying confrontation in a kitchen with all the evidence laid out like a verdict. Some things just kept growing, slowly, toward whatever light was available, refusing to fully die even when every reasonable person would have understood if they had. She put the kettle on. In the next room, Alina was explaining with great patience why the dragon needed a better desk. Ti-Woo was listening like it was the most important conversation in the world. Maybe Jasmine thought for tonight it was. That's the end of Jasmine's story, not because everything is resolved, but because some of the best endings are the honest ones. Did Ti-Woo deserve a second chance? Did Jasmine make the right call? Drop your verdict in the comments below. Thank you for living through this entire journey with me. I'm Dee, and this has been Afro Soul Diaries by Dee. I'll see you in the next one.